Good day, friends, and welcome back to Conflicts of the Human Race. Today, I will tell you about the entire story of the Anglo-Spanish War, 1585–1604. Now buckle up as we begin. By 1585, tensions between Protestant England and Catholic Spain had reached a breaking point. Queen Elizabeth I's England represented a growing threat to Philip II's Spanish hegemony in Europe and the New World. The roots of conflict lay deep in religious division, commercial rivalry, and competing imperial ambitions. Spain controlled vast territories in the Americas, generating enormous wealth through silver mines and trade monopolies. England, meanwhile, had emerged as a maritime power with ambitious merchants and skilled sailors eager to challenge Spanish dominance. Elizabeth's support for Protestant rebels in the Spanish Netherlands and her tacit approval of English privateers raiding Spanish treasure ships had pushed diplomatic relations beyond repair. The execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, in 1587 would further inflame Catholic Spain's determination to restore England to papal authority. What followed would be 19 years of intermittent but brutal warfare across multiple theaters. The immediate catalyst for war came in 1585, when Elizabeth signed the Treaty of Nonsuch, formally allying England with the Dutch Protestant rebels fighting Spanish rule in the Netherlands. This treaty committed England to provide military support, including troops and financial aid, to the Dutch cause. Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, was dispatched with an expeditionary force of 7,000 men to assist the rebellion. Philip II viewed this as a direct act of aggression against Spanish sovereignty. Simultaneously, English privateers like Sir Francis Drake had been conducting increasingly bold raids against Spanish shipping and colonial possessions. The distinction between state-sanctioned warfare and piracy became blurred as Elizabeth granted letters of marque to English captains while maintaining plausible deniability. Spanish ambassadors protested these attacks, but diplomatic solutions proved elusive. The religious dimension added another layer of complexity, as Philip saw himself as the defender of Catholic Christendom against Protestant heresy. Pope Sixtus V had declared Elizabeth excommunicate, effectively legitimizing Catholic efforts to depose her. By late 1585, both nations were preparing for what would become a protracted and costly conflict that would reshape the balance of European power. Sir Francis Drake's raid on Cadiz in April 1587 marked a dramatic escalation in Anglo-Spanish hostilities. Leading a fleet of 30 ships, Drake launched a surprise attack on the Spanish port, destroying an estimated 10,000 tons of shipping and supplies intended for the planned invasion of England. The audacious raid, which Drake famously described as singeing the King of Spain's beard, dealt a significant blow to Spanish naval preparations and delayed the Armada by nearly a year. Drake's fleet systematically destroyed galleons, supply ships, and naval stores, while also capturing valuable cargo. The psychological impact was perhaps even greater than the material damage, demonstrating English naval capabilities and Philip's vulnerability even in Spanish home waters. Following the Cadiz raid, Drake continued his campaign along the Portuguese coast, capturing the fortress of Sagres and intercepting the treasure ship San Felipe laden with East Indian spices and goods worth over £100,000. These successes boosted English morale and provided crucial intelligence about Spanish naval preparations. However, they also convinced Philip II that only a decisive military campaign could eliminate the English threat to Spanish interests and restore Catholic rule to England. The execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, on February 8, 1587, provided Philip II with the final justification he needed for his enterprise of England. Mary, a Catholic claimant to the English throne, had been imprisoned by Elizabeth for 19 years following her flight from Scotland. Her involvement in the Babington plot, a conspiracy to assassinate Elizabeth and place Mary on the throne, led to her trial and death sentence. The execution shocked Catholic Europe and was seen as a martyrdom that demanded vengeance. Philip, who had previously been cautious about direct military intervention in England, now viewed the invasion as both a political necessity and a religious crusade. The Pope promised to contribute 1 million ducats to the expedition once Spanish troops landed in England. Spanish propaganda portrayed the coming invasion as a holy war to restore England to the Catholic faith and punish the Protestant usurper, Elizabeth. Preparations intensified across Spanish territories as Philip assembled what would become known as the Invincible Armada. The scale of the undertaking was unprecedented, requiring coordination between Spanish naval forces, the Duke of Parma's army in the Netherlands, and extensive logistical support. The stage was set for one of history's most famous naval confrontations. Throughout 1587 and early 1588, Philip II assembled the most formidable naval force Europe had ever seen. The Spanish Armada comprised 130 ships carrying approximately 30,000 men, including 19,000 soldiers and 8,000 sailors. The fleet included powerful galleons, converted merchant vessels, and support ships loaded with supplies, ammunition, and siege equipment. Command was given to the Duke of Medina Sidonia after the death of the experienced Admiral Santa Cruz during preparations. The plan was complex. The Armada would sail up the English Channel to rendezvous with the Duke of Parma's veteran army of 17,000 men waiting in the Spanish Netherlands. This combined force would then invade England and march on London. English intelligence networks, coordinated by Sir Francis Walsingham, had been tracking these preparations extensively. Elizabeth's government responded by strengthening coastal defences, organising militia forces, and preparing the English fleet under Lord Admiral Charles Howard. The English Navy, though smaller in total tonnage, possessed advantages in speed, manoeuvrability, and gunnery. Sir Francis Drake served as Vice Admiral, bringing his extensive experience of Spanish tactics and waters. As spring turned to summer in 1588, both nations braced for a confrontation that would determine England's independence and the future of Protestant Christianity in Europe. The Spanish Armada set sail from Lisbon on May 28, 1588, but was immediately beset by challenges that would plague the entire campaign. Severe storms scattered the fleet and forced it to seek refuge in Corunna for repairs and resupply, delaying the invasion by nearly a month. This setback allowed the English additional time to complete their preparations and position their forces. When the Armada finally departed Corunna on July 12, it faced the daunting task of maintaining formation while navigating the treacherous waters of the Bay of Biscay. The Spanish fleet's crescent formation, designed to protect the slower supply ships in the center, proved difficult to maintain in rough seas. English scouts had been monitoring Spanish movements, and beacon fires along the English coast provided early warning of the Armada's approach. On July 19, the first Spanish ships were sighted off the Lizard Peninsula in Cornwall. Captain Thomas Fleming of the bark Golden Hind brought news of the sighting to Plymouth, where Drake was reportedly playing bowls. His famous response, that there was time to finish the game and defeat the Spanish, reflected the confidence of English commanders despite facing a numerically superior enemy. The English fleet began working its way out of Plymouth Harbour against contrary winds, positioning itself to engage the approaching Armada. The first major engagement occurred off Plymouth on July 21, 1588, as Lord Admiral Howard led the English fleet against the Spanish vanguard. The battle revealed the fundamental tactical differences between the two naval powers. The Spanish, following Mediterranean traditions, sought to close with English ships for boarding actions, relying on their superior numbers of soldiers. The English, however, employed standoff tactics, using their ships' superior speed and maneuverability to maintain distance while pounding the Spanish vessels with long-range cannon fire. Drake in the Revenge and Frobisher in the Triumph demonstrated the effectiveness of English gunnery, inflicting damage while avoiding the deadly embrace of Spanish boarding parties. The Spanish formation remained disciplined despite the attacks, with Medina Sidonia managing to keep his fleet together while proceeding up the channel toward the planned rendezvous with Parma. Several Spanish ships sustained significant damage, including the flagship San Martin, but none were lost in this first encounter. The English captured the Rosario after she collided with another Spanish vessel, and was abandoned by the main fleet. This initial success provided valuable intelligence about Spanish strength and tactics. As night fell, both fleets continued eastward, with running battles expected to resume at dawn. The pattern was established. English hit-and-run attacks against a Spanish formation, determined to reach its destination despite mounting casualties. Fighting continued as both fleets moved eastward through the English Channel, with significant action off Portland Bill on July 23. The Spanish attempted to gain the weather gauge, positioning themselves upwind to control the battle's tempo, but English seamanship prevented this tactical advantage. Drake and Hawkins coordinated attacks on the Spanish rear guard, while Frobisher's squadron engaged the main body. The battle demonstrated the effectiveness of English long-range gunnery against Spanish attempts at close-quarters combat. Several Spanish vessels sustained heavy damage, including the galleon San Mateo, which began taking on water after repeated English broadsides. However, Spanish discipline held firm, and Medina Sidonia's flagship continued to anchor the formation's center. The English were surprised by the resilience of Spanish construction and the effectiveness of their defensive tactics. Running low on ammunition after prolonged engagements, Howard was forced to break off the attack and shadow the Armada from a safe distance. Intelligence reports indicated that the Duke of Parma's invasion army was not yet ready to embark, creating an opportunity to prevent the crucial rendezvous. As the Spanish fleet anchored off Calais on July 27, both sides prepared for what would become the campaign's decisive phase. The narrow waters of the Dover Strait would prove the graveyard of Spanish ambitions. The Spanish Armada's arrival off Calais on July 27 placed Medina Sidonia in an impossible tactical situation. The treacherous sandbanks and strong currents of the Dover Strait made anchoring dangerous, while the Duke of Parma's army remained unprepared for the hazardous channel crossing. English reinforcements under Lord Henry Seymour joined Howard's fleet, bringing English strength to over 140 vessels. Recognizing the vulnerability of the anchored Spanish fleet, English commanders decided to employ fireships vessels loaded with combustible materials and explosives, then set ablaze and sailed into enemy formations. On the night of July 28, 8 English fireships were prepared under Drake's supervision, filled with tar, pitch, and gunpowder. As these floating infernos approached the Spanish anchorage, panic spread through the Armada. Spanish captains cut their anchor cables and fled toward the North Sea, abandoning their carefully maintained formation. The fireship attack itself caused minimal direct damage, but its psychological impact was devastating. The Spanish fleet, which had maintained discipline through days of running battles, was now scattered and disorganized. Several ships collided in the darkness, while others found themselves isolated and vulnerable to English attack. The San Lorenzo, flagship of the galley squadron, ran aground near Calais and was captured by English boats. Dawn on July 29 revealed the Armada in complete disarray, setting the stage for the climactic Battle of Gravelines. The Battle of Gravelines on July 29, 1588, marked the decisive defeat of the Spanish Armada. As dawn broke, the English fleet found the scattered Spanish ships attempting to reform their battle line. Howard divided his forces into 4 squadrons, with Drake, Hawkins, and Frobisher each leading coordinated attacks on different sections of the disorganized Armada. The English exploited their tactical advantage ruthlessly, closing to effective range and delivering devastating broadsides before withdrawing to reload. Spanish attempts to grapple and board English vessels failed repeatedly as English captains used superior maneuverability to maintain distance. The San Felipe and San Mateo, both flagship-class galleons, sustained such heavy damage that they later ran aground on the Dutch coast. The Spanish formation, already compromised by the fireship attack, completely collapsed under sustained English pressure. Medina Sidonia's flagship, San Martin, took over 200 hits but remained afloat through superior construction. As the battle progressed, strong winds began driving the battered Spanish fleet toward the dangerous Flemish sandbanks known as the Banks of Dunkirk. Only a providential wind shift prevented the complete destruction of the Armada on these treacherous shoals. By evening, the Spanish fleet was in full retreat northward, abandoning any hope of rendezvous with Parma's army. The invasion of England had failed catastrophically, with Spanish casualties mounting and ammunition nearly exhausted. Following their defeat at Gravelines, the remnants of the Spanish Armada faced a nightmare voyage home around the storm-lashed coasts of Scotland and Ireland. Medina Sidonia, recognizing that the invasion had failed irreversibly, made the desperate decision to return to Spain via the northern route rather than fight his way back through the English Channel. The journey would prove more destructive than English cannon fire. Lacking adequate charts for these treacherous waters and short of provisions after the extended campaign, Spanish ships began falling victim to the harsh North Atlantic conditions. Storms scattered the fleet, while crews weakened by battle wounds and disease struggled to maintain their vessels. The Irish coast proved particularly deadly, as unfamiliar currents and hidden reefs claimed ship after ship. Local Irish clans, despite sharing Catholic faith with the Spanish, often proved hostile to the shipwrecked survivors, either killing them outright or handing them over to English authorities for execution. The Gianna, carrying survivors from several wrecked vessels, was lost with nearly 1,300 men when she struck rocks near the Giant's Causeway. By the time the surviving Spanish ships began limping into Spanish ports in September and October, Philip II had lost over 60 vessels and 15,000 men. The human cost of the failed invasion was staggering, representing one of the greatest naval disasters in European history. The defeat of the Spanish Armada transformed the strategic balance of European power, but the Anglo-Spanish War was far from over. Elizabeth I, emboldened by the victory, authorized the Count Armada expedition of 1589 under Sir Francis Drake and Sir John Norreys. This ambitious campaign aimed to destroy the remaining Spanish fleet in its home ports, support Portuguese rebels against Spanish rule, and establish a permanent English base in the Azores to intercept treasure fleets. The expedition assembled 150 ships and 18,000 men, making it larger than the original Spanish Armada. However, the English campaign suffered from divided objectives and poor coordination. The attack on Corunna achieved limited success, destroying some shipping but failing to eliminate the Spanish fleet's core strength. The attempt to capture Lisbon and spark a Portuguese uprising proved disastrous, with English forces meeting fierce resistance and finding little popular support. Drake's inability to locate and engage the Spanish treasure fleet meant the expedition generated insufficient prize money to cover its costs. Disease ravaged English ranks during the prolonged campaign, and nearly 11,000 men died from typhus and dysentery. The Count Armada's failure demonstrated that naval victory alone could not resolve the underlying conflict between Protestant England and Catholic Spain. Both nations remained committed to a struggle that would continue for another 15 years through various forms of warfare. The war's focus shifted increasingly to commerce raiding and colonial warfare, as both sides recognized the impossibility of decisive knockout blows. English privateers, operating with royal letters of marque, systematically attacked Spanish shipping throughout the Atlantic. Captains like Christopher Newport, William Parker, and George Clifford, Earl of Cumberland, became legendary for their raids on Spanish treasure fleets and colonial ports. The Spanish responded by organizing heavily armed convoys and strengthening colonial defenses, but could not eliminate the English threat entirely. In 1595, Drake and Hawkins launched their final expedition to the Spanish Main, targeting Panama and other key ports. The campaign began disastrously when Spanish forces, forewarned of English intentions, repulsed the attack on Las Palmas. Both English commanders died during the expedition, Hawkins of disease off Puerto Rico and Drake of dysentery near Portobelo. Their deaths marked the end of an era of English naval heroism, but younger captains continued the tradition of aggressive commerce warfare. The Spanish, meanwhile, began developing new tactics for dealing with English raiders, including faster patrol vessels and improved intelligence networks. Colonial warfare intensified as both sides sought to damage their enemies' economic foundations. The Caribbean became a primary theater of operations, with repeated English attempts to establish permanent bases in Spanish-controlled waters meeting determined Spanish resistance. Spain's response to English naval aggression came in the form of 2 additional Armada expeditions, both of which ended in failure due to Atlantic storms. The Second Spanish Armada of 1596, under the command of Martin de Padilla, consisted of 98 ships and was intended to support Irish rebellion against English rule. However, severe storms scattered the fleet before it could reach Irish waters, forcing the Spanish to abandon the mission and return to port. The Third Spanish Armada of 1597, led by the same commander, met an equally disastrous fate when hurricane-force winds destroyed much of the fleet off the Spanish coast. These repeated failures demonstrated the difficulties of mounting large-scale naval operations across the unpredictable Atlantic Ocean. Meanwhile, English raids on Spanish territory intensified under commanders like the Earl of Essex. The 1596 English expedition against Cadiz, led by Essex and Lord Admiral Howard, achieved spectacular success by capturing and sacking the city while destroying significant Spanish shipping. The raid netted enormous booty and demonstrated England's ability to strike Spanish ports at will. However, Essex's failure to hold Cadiz permanently or intercept the treasure fleet limited the strategic impact. The Spanish rebuilt their defenses and continued to receive American silver, though in reduced quantities due to English interference. Both sides began to recognize that the war had reached a strategic stalemate, with neither nation capable of delivering a decisive blow against the other. The conflict took on a new dimension with increased Spanish support for Irish rebellion against English rule. The 9 Years' War in Ireland, 1594–1603, became intimately connected with the broader Anglo-Spanish conflict as Philip III, who succeeded his father in 1598, provided military aid to Irish chieftains like Hugh O'Neill, Earl of Tyrone. Spanish advisors, weapons, and eventually troops flowed to Ireland, creating a dangerous second front for English forces. The Irish saw Spanish support as crucial for their struggle against Protestant English colonization and religious persecution. Small Spanish expeditions landed in Ireland throughout the 1590s, providing training and supplies to Irish forces. The most significant intervention came in 1601, when a Spanish expedition of 34 troops under Don Juan de Aguila landed at Kinsale in southern Ireland. This force was intended to coordinate with Irish armies for a decisive campaign against English rule. However, poor communications and English military effectiveness undermined the Spanish-Irish alliance. Lord Mountjoy's English forces besieged the Spanish garrison at Kinsale, while intercepting Irish reinforcements attempting to reach their allies. The Battle of Kinsale in December 1601 ended in decisive English victory, with Irish forces routed and Spanish troops forced to surrender. The failure at Kinsale effectively ended both organized Irish resistance and Spanish hopes of using Ireland as a base for attacking England. The Irish campaign's collapse removed one of Spain's few remaining strategic options for pressuring English interests. The death of Elizabeth I on March 24, 1603, and the accession of James VI of Scotland as James I of England dramatically altered the war's political context. James, unlike his predecessor, had no personal animosity towards Spain and was genuinely committed to peace. His mother, Mary, Queen of Scots, had been Philip II's ally, and James himself had maintained correspondence with Spanish agents throughout Elizabeth's reign. The new king's Pacific inclinations coincided with growing war weariness in both England and Spain. Philip III, facing financial crisis due to the enormous costs of prolonged warfare, was equally eager for peace negotiations. The Spanish treasury had been drained by decades of military campaigns in the Netherlands, France, and against England, while American silver revenues had declined due to English privateering and administrative inefficiency. James I began secret negotiations with Spanish representatives almost immediately after his coronation, using intermediaries to explore terms for ending hostilities. The English business community, which had initially profited from privateering, now suffered from Spanish retaliation against English merchants in continental markets. War had become economically unsustainable for both nations. Preliminary peace discussions began in earnest during 1603, though public hostilities continued while diplomats worked toward a comprehensive settlement. The stage was set for formal negotiations that would end nearly 2 decades of intermittent but costly warfare between Europe's 2 leading maritime powers. Formal peace negotiations began in London in May 1604, with delegations from both nations eager to conclude a comprehensive treaty. The English delegation was led by Robert Cecil, Earl of Salisbury, who had served as Elizabeth's Secretary of State and understood the war's costs intimately. The Spanish delegation included the Count of Villamediana and Jean Richardot, representing Philip III's interests and those of the Spanish Netherlands, respectively. Key issues included the status of English trade with Spanish territories, the question of Dutch independence, and the treatment of English Catholics. James I proved willing to make significant concessions to secure peace, abandoning Elizabeth's aggressive support for Dutch rebels and agreeing to restrict English privateering activities. The Spanish, in turn, accepted English territorial gains and implicitly recognized Protestant succession in England. Religious questions proved particularly complex, with Spanish negotiators seeking guarantees for English Catholic subjects, while English representatives insisted on maintaining Protestant supremacy. Commercial arrangements required extensive discussion, as both sides sought favorable trade terms while protecting their colonial interests. The Dutch delegation, led by representatives who feared abandonment by their English allies, attempted to influence negotiations, but found themselves increasingly marginalized. After months of detailed bargaining, the essential framework for peace emerged. Both sides recognized that continued warfare served neither nation's interests, particularly given the rising power of France under Henry IV and ongoing Ottoman pressure in the Mediterranean. The Treaty of London was formally signed on August 18, 1604, officially ending the Anglo-Spanish War and establishing a new framework for relations between the 2 powers. The treaty's terms reflected the military stalemate that had characterized the conflict's later years, with neither side achieving decisive victory. England agreed to cease supporting Dutch rebels directly, while Spain implicitly recognized James I's legitimacy and abandoned claims to restore Catholic rule in England. Commercial provisions allowed English merchants to trade in Spanish European territories, while maintaining Spanish exclusion of foreign merchants from American colonies. The privateering that had characterized much of the war was officially terminated, with both sides agreeing to respect each other's shipping and territorial waters. Religious clauses provided limited protection for English Catholics while maintaining Protestant supremacy in England. The Dutch question remained unresolved, with Spain continuing to claim sovereignty over the rebellious provinces, while England adopted official neutrality. Financial settlements addressed the complex issue of prizes taken during the war, with both sides agreeing to general amnesty rather than attempting detailed compensation. The treaty represented a pragmatic acknowledgement that neither nation could afford continued warfare. For England, peace meant freedom to pursue colonial expansion without Spanish interference. For Spain, the treaty provided respite from English attacks, while allowing focus on other pressing concerns, including the ongoing Dutch revolt and Ottoman naval power in the Mediterranean. The immediate aftermath of the Treaty of London saw both nations working to implement the peace settlement while adjusting to the new strategic reality. English privateers were recalled from Spanish waters, though some continued operating unofficially in the Caribbean, where enforcement proved difficult. Spanish ports reopened to English merchants, leading to renewed commercial relationships that had been interrupted by nearly 2 decades of warfare. James I's court welcomed Spanish ambassadors and began exploring closer diplomatic ties, including potential marriage alliances between the royal families. The Dutch, feeling abandoned by their English allies, intensified their own military efforts against Spain while seeking new sources of support. French influence in European affairs grew as the Anglo-Spanish rivalry diminished, with Henry IV skillfully exploiting the new balance of power. English attention began shifting toward colonial expansion in North America and trading opportunities in the East Indies, no longer constrained by Spanish opposition. The 1607 establishment of Jamestown, Virginia, represented the beginning of sustained English colonial development that the peace treaty made possible. Spain, relieved of English pressure, concentrated on modernizing its navy and colonial administration while attempting to resolve the Dutch revolt through negotiation rather than force alone. Both nations discovered that peace brought new opportunities and challenges, requiring adaptation of institutions and policies developed during the long years of conflict. The war's end marked not just the conclusion of hostilities, but the beginning of a new phase in European international relations. The Anglo-Spanish War's legacy extended far beyond the immediate territorial and commercial settlements of 1604. England's successful defense against the Spanish Armada became a foundational myth of national identity, celebrating Protestant resistance to Catholic tyranny and naval supremacy over continental powers. The conflict established England as a major European power capable of challenging Spanish hegemony and defending Protestant interests across Europe. Spanish prestige, while damaged by the Armada's defeat, remained substantial due to the empire's vast territorial holdings and continued influx of American wealth. The war's economic costs contributed to both nations' growing focus on efficiency and reform in military and administrative systems. English naval tactics and ship design, proven effective against Spanish galleons, influenced maritime warfare for generations. The conflict also demonstrated the importance of intelligence networks, with both sides developing sophisticated spy systems that continued operating in peacetime. Colonial rivalry, temporarily suspended by the treaty, would resume in different forms as both nations pursued American expansion. The war's religious dimensions gradually diminished in importance as political and commercial considerations became paramount in European diplomacy. Most significantly, the conflict marked the beginning of England's rise as a global maritime power, setting the stage for future colonial empire and eventual naval supremacy. The 19-year struggle between these Catholic and Protestant powers reshaped European balance, proving that even the mighty Spanish Empire could be successfully challenged by smaller but more agile opponents. If you liked today's story, make sure to check out our other videos on our channel. Have a nice day.